6 quarters of deceleration in the Indian economy, in the growth of GDP, has brought India to its longest spell of slowdown in nearly 2 decades. How is the country, how is the economy going to deal with this, is what we are here to discuss with the Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Dr. Bibek Debroy. Welcome, Dr. Debroy. Let's start with the basics. Does the PM even believe that we are in slowdown?
Well, you are directing a question meant for the PM towards me.
Okay.
So, I do not think I am the right person to answer that question at all. Now, so far as I am concerned, were you to be directing the question towards me, it is an undeniable fact that growth has slowed. And so, therefore, the moot question is what does one do to improve the growth rate. But just on the factual part of it, our quarterly figures have always been somewhat unreliable. They are all estimates, and the firm figures are always available at the end of the year. And therefore, I do not think we should get too swayed by quarterly figures, especially because they also depend on what happened at exactly that same point 1 year ago in the same quarter. Broadly speaking, this year we are talking about a growth rate of something around 5%. I believe next year the growth rate will go up to 6%. So, that is the kind of number we are talking about. Is that enough? Of course not. It needs to be higher. It needs to be higher for reducing poverty, ensuring employment, assorted other reasons. But it is not quite true that the growth is not there. It is just that growth has slowed, to use your expression, to 5 to 6%.
Arvind Subramanian says that we are in great slowdown, and that we are headed towards ICU.
I recently read a piece by Arvind Panagaria, who had quoted a piece that Arvind Subramanian wrote in 2000, saying that we were in ICU. So, clearly the economy emerged from the ICU as long as Arvind Subramanian was the chief economic advisor, and has gone back into ICU since he left.
If we look at what Geeta Gopinath said about this slowdown, saying that we need enormous structural reforms on the way, what is it that's going through the PM-EAC? What is your advisory to the Prime Minister about the state of the economy? How are you recommending that we get out of this state of deceleration before we start to at least grow at a rapid pace?
Let me separate out those elements, because this is an economic advisory council to the Prime Minister. So, therefore, it offers advice to the Prime Minister. So, therefore, since it is not an economic advisory council to the world in general, what the Economic Advisory Council tells the Prime Minister must always remain confidential. So, I am not answering the question about what we tell the Prime Minister. Instead, I am reacting to that bit in your question which asked about what Geeta Gopinath has written. She is not the first person to mention structural reforms. It boils down to the issue of what one means by structural reforms. Traditionally, when economists, not just Geeta Gopinath, but other economists also, when they have talked about structural reforms, they have fundamentally meant factor markets, land and or natural resources, labor, capital markets, and sometimes the privatization of public sector enterprises. And the privatization agenda should not mean only union public sector enterprises, but should also mean state private sector, public sector enterprises. There are reasons and legitimate reasons why these structural reforms have been so slow. No one disagrees that these are important. No one disagrees that these are important to stimulate growth rates in states. After all, the All India growth rate is an aggregate of growth rates in states. But the reasons why progress has always been slow, and not since 2014, it has been slow since 1991, is because several of these are state subjects. Sometimes they are on the concurrent list, sometimes there are legislative issues, sometimes there is a political economic process. So, yes, they are important, but the movement will be slow. To give some examples of what the union government has already said, on the labor laws, there were about 50 odd union labor laws. They have been streamlined into 4 codes now, and there has been relaxation on some of the rigid elements. Several of the states have already eased their labor laws, particularly on the so called offensive segment, namely chapter 5b of the Industrial Disputes Act. On land, it is entirely a state subject. Again, it is a debatable question whether Union Parliament should legislate on something that is entirely a state subject, but nonetheless we had that 2013 piece of legislation. That 2013 piece of legislation indeed has increased land costs, particularly for infrastructural projects, has made land acquisition difficult. I do believe that that law should be changed, but whether that law is changed or amended is entirely a function of what state governments decide to do. So far as privatization is concerned, the government has already announced that it is serious about privatization, whether it is BPCL, whether it is Air India, but privatization is a process. There is a certain number that one uses for budgetary computations, whether it is 1,05,000 crores or something else, but it is a process, because some of the land, often the bulk of the land is owned by state governments, it has to be returned to state governments. So, yes, structural reforms are important, but there is no miracle wand that ensures structural reforms overnight.
Dr. Debroy, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect in the way the government is approaching it and the way the economists see, which is that the government seems to be working towards reviving the investment cycle, while everybody, including economists like Arvind Subramanian, Geeta Gopinath, everybody outside is saying it is a consumption problem, it is a demand problem in the economy. There seems to be no effect of the government's measures so far on the economic revival. Where are we headed?
Let us take the second part first, that any policy change that is done, any instrument that is done, leads to results with a time lag of anything between 18 months to 2 years. That is empirical fact based on not other countries, but based on what has happened in India. Economists, and I am one myself, are very prone to giving easy solutions without thinking the consequences through. I want to stimulate demand. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean I want you to give sectoral concessions? If I am going to give sectoral concessions, am I as an economist accepting that I want the distortion that arbitrary discretion leads to? Am I saying I should give across the board fiscal concessions? In the process, the question arises that what happens to my deficit? Am I saying that I should automatically monetize the deficit? The consensus about not automatically monetize the deficit was developed over a large number of years since the 1990s. Am I saying that because in this compulsion to stimulate demand, I am accepting the monetization of the deficit and thereby an increase in inflation going back to the unsustainable inflation levels? What is it that I am precisely attempting to do? Arvind Subramanian himself was part of the government, and I am sure he had then stated very clearly the trade-offs. Geeta Gopinath was an advisor and she is now with the IMF. She also must clearly, I am sure, is familiar with the phenomenon of stating clearly the trade-offs. So, the entire trade-off has to be clearly stated, otherwise simply saying stimulate demand is neither here nor there.
So, people say that income tax cuts, income tax rate cuts or slashing of some of the slabs, complete transmission of interest rates should stimulate some demand, also incentivize the industry to start spending on new projects at some point in time. Just some of the measures that are being recommended, but it seems that the government is in no hurry to look at the demand, it is only focused on the investment cycle.
Well, industry demanded a cut in the tax rate.
Yeah.
That cut was done with the removal of exemptions. There is no particular evidence that industry has responded.
Yes.
I think industry is at the moment suffering from excess capacity in some sectors. There are some signs of investment happening in certain segments, not across the board. So far as the personal income tax bit is concerned, I would say exactly the same thing. One should have personal income tax cuts only when exemptions are removed. You cannot have a situation where I want lower tax rates, I want exemptions, I want airports like the West, I want railway stations like China, I want highways which are like the US or Germany. I cannot have a situation where the tax GDP ratio of union government plus states is around just over 16% and my demands are 6% on education, 4% on health, 10% on infrastructure, 3% on defense. I am already at 23%. So, my demands amongst the ones I am cited are 23% of GDP. As citizens, I am willing to pay 16%. Between 5 to 5.5% of GDP every year is on exemptions. So, trade-off, something that is taught in Economics 101 in the first class, is about opportunity costs. If citizens, and after all in a democracy anything that the government does is indirect manifestation of the will of the people. As citizens, are we therefore saying that we want that lower income tax rate, we do not want to pay taxes, but we are willing to forego all of this? I do not think so.
But then what is the solution? There is no trigger. You are saying that the government does not have the wherewithal or the leeway to trigger
I did not say that. I said that there is very little fiscal leeway to reduce personal income tax rates, although many people are very reluctant to pay personal income taxes. The government has very limited leeway to reduce personal income tax rates while retaining the exemptions. I think as a society, we should begin to ask, why is it the case that out of 49.4 million income tax assessees who submitted returns in 2017-18, this was reported in your sister paper, a question was asked about how many people own 2 or more houses. And in this entire country, the number of people who own 2 or more houses was exactly 2,715. If someone comes to me and says this is a believable figure, I am sorry, I do not find it believable. So, you must recognize that even with the present rates, there are plenty of people who do not pay the legitimate taxes. Now, if people do not pay legitimate taxes, obviously you cannot have reductions in tax rates for everyone. If 2/3 of India does not pay taxes on agricultural income even when it is above the threshold, because it is a state subject and states are reluctant to tax agricultural income for the most part, then you cannot have reductions in tax rates across the board.
But that's the government's job to catch them. But what about, let's say, what about the transmission? Interest rate transmission still not happened. If you look at when the rate started, when the RBI started cutting rates in 2014, from then there has been about a 3% reduction on repo rates. The banks have not transmitted a percent and slightly more than that onto the users.
Firstly, you see, on the banks part, the banks are suffering from a legacy of NPAs. The banks are suffering from a legacy of risk aversion, and there is a reason for that. There was one particular section of the Prevention of Corruption Act which made all public servants, not just banks, risk averse. It was meant to be amended so that you actually punished mala fide decisions, but also protected the bona fide. That amendment, when it was finally passed by Parliament, was sort of watered down, and therefore banks continue to be risk averse, and as I said, shall continue to be risk averse as long as that exists. It is also true that now, because banks are risk averse, the lending rate has become much more layered, in the sense that the lending rate now builds into it a risk premium. And the fact of the matter is that a large chunk of business earlier was not very familiar or refused to accept the idea of exit of capital. Rare is it the case in India until recently that promoters actually exited. Competition and structural reforms I mentioned earlier is not just land labor, it is also capital markets, and all competition requires entry as well as exit. But coming back to this, because the corporate sector has not exactly covered itself out with glory, nor have corporate governance stakeholders like auditors, we have a situation where the risk premium or the range of risk premium has widened.
But in some ways, by letting banks retain that 1.2%, you're practically, it's a quasi funding of banks. If it wasn't at 90 lakh crore of loan outstanding, you're essentially talking of almost 1,20,000 crore of funding of banks every year on behalf of the consumer's account.
Look, there is a broader agenda of banking reforms, and the broader agenda of banking reforms has all kinds of issues that are outside the budget. There are issues of the interest rate on small savings. There are issues of what should be the deposit rates, because the deposit rates, essentially, if I have a floor set by the interest rate on small savings, the banks effectively have to compete for the deposit rates. Now, the moment I have a high deposit rate, automatically the lending rate is going to be correspondingly higher.
Yeah.
So, there are broader issues. Now, these broader issues are beyond the immediate purview of the budget.
So, what are the options before the government in the run up to this budget? What is it that we should expect? You are saying that government has no leeway to cut taxes. Interest rate transmission hasn't happened fully, and yet you have a slowing economy and shortfall in indirect taxes. GST taxes are just not matching up to the
you see, I am just saying that the budget is only one day in a government's life of 365 days. One should not expect the budget to fix everything. It is not meant to. The GST decisions happen through the GST Council. It is the purview of the GST Council. So far as direct taxes are concerned, there was a task force that was set up to examine direct taxes, and it had stated, to the extent I understand it, that exemption should be withdrawn.
Yeah.
Now, whether the budget is the right time to do it or whether it will be done at some point is for the finance minister to the call for the finance minister to take. So far as the growth bit of it is concerned, I said that I think next year it is going to go up to 6%. There are plenty of measures that the government has already taken. The monetary transmission, some of it is a transmission problem, but some of it is also the fact that I do think by the way that the real interest rate should be lower, that the price on capital should be lower, but some of it is also because of the fact that there isn't much demand for bank lending. That, I think, if you give it a couple of quarters, will automatically change.
So, you think that we should just let the economy be, let it settle, do nothing about consumption, do nothing about demand?
I did not say that. I said that to do something about consumption, to do something about demand, you don't have to do it on just one particular day. Expecting that it happens on one particular day is a legacy of a mindset. That particular day is of course good for media, it is good for television because it gets bites, it gets viewers, but the era when everything happens on one single day is over and done with.
That is fine, but what would you do for demand? That is the point. What can the government do to stimulate demand, to ensure that demand happens, and so the private investment, the capacity utilization.
You see, so far as the demand is concerned, the finance minister has already announced that whatever was budgeted in terms of government expenditure in this year's budget, not next year's budget, which was held up for various reasons, is going to be speeded up. She's already ensured that she's already instructed that any delayed payments on the part of union government departments and central public sector enterprises should be sort of speeded up. When we are talking about government expenditure, please also realize that more than 62% of public expenditure happens at the level of the states. It is completely unreasonable to expect that the union government can do much in the way of speeding up public expenditure at the level of the states. Do remember that the 14th Finance Commission has enhanced the untied contribution of the states to 42%.
But that's almost a state of haplessness, no, from the government's, from the centre's point
Why?
of view. How are you expecting then that our growth rate will improve to 6% if we know that this quarter, especially up to now, end of November, we know it hasn't been any better than last quarter. So this quarter is definitely gone, right?
No, but I already told you two things. Firstly, I said that one should not set too much store by the quarterly figures. And secondly, I told you that there are already signs, maybe not robust enough, that it has begun to improve from the month of about November.
Like what?
A whole range of indicators,
For instance, some of them, what do you think?
You track them, so we also track them. Why shall I tell you which ones we track?
No, so far we have not seen any sign as yet. I mean, we are seeing for instance, automobile sales, if you look at October to…
automobiles, what automobile sales do you look at?
We look at sales of automobiles.
What is the definition of that automobile?
The sales to the consumer.
I understand that. Hang on.
Yes.
What is the automobile which sales you look at?
Cars and two-wheelers, even tractors.
You are not getting my question.
Yes.
Do you look at sales of new automobiles or do you look at sales of second-hand automobiles?
New automobiles.
Precisely.
Yes.
Now, please go and check what has happened to sales of second-hand automobiles.
Second-hand automobiles are now selling more. Yeah?
Yes, they have shot up.
But that's
a
crisis of confidence.
No, it is not. It is not.
Okay.
It's a very rational decision because I do not know
whether I have a job tomorrow or not.
No, don't jump to unwarranted conclusions. It is a very calculated decision because media has made me expect that suddenly the GST rate on automobiles will be slashed. So, why should I buy a new car? Because media has led me to expect that there will be new norms with new technology next year. So, it is not that I don't have a job. It is that the automobile sector is one where I am taking a rational decision, except you are interpreting it in the wrong way.
Are you seeing any other signs of an uptick?
Yes, commercial real estate, track it.
Commercial real estate actually never was as bad as residential.
Now, you are going around in circles. I am telling you, look at commercial real estate, it has improved. Look at steel, it has improved. Don't look at
cement haven't improved.
No. Yeah. There are inefficient companies, there are efficient ones.
Yeah.
Look at steel, look at the recent figures, look at cement, look at the recent figures.
So, you think these are enough to revive the economy?
I did not say that. I said that the November figures show an improvement.
Yeah.
I also said not long enough time period for it to be robust.
But you are saying next year is definitely going to be way better than this year.
Way
5
better
to
meaning
6%.
I gave you numbers. I said
Yeah.
5%, 6%. Way better is a subjective term.
Okay. How do you see the investment cycle reviving? You've seen that the last 2 months we've seen index of industrial production. The industrial production has been in the negative, the growth has been in the negative. Do you think that is anywhere closer to revival? This is the first that we have seen in many, many years.
You see, the IIP captures some things, it does not capture all things. And again, I am repeating a point I already made. I made that about quarterly figures, I would said that about monthly figures also. That the monthly figures depend on what the base was last year. And also that there is always a time lag. So, hence I will stick my neck out and say that you give it another quarter and you will see better IIP figures. I use the word better, I did not say spectacularly better, because the investment cycle, for the investment cycle to revive across the board, not specific sectors, I think will take another 2 quarters.
We have seen the trend of the economy, especially since demonetization, and you were one of the biggest supporters of demonetization. Do you still believe it was the right step, or do you think it was something that was a wrong call?
Define demonetization for me. The reason I am asking this, because again you will not understand the question, is there were certain events that happened on 8th of November. And there were certain events that happened around 8th of November. And by demonetization, do we mean what happened on the 8th or things around that? There is a distinction, because so far as the 8th of November instances were concerned, whatever evidence I have seen, whether it was done by Arvind Subramaniam, Geeta Gopinath, CMI, does not show the 8th November effects to have lasted for more than a quarter.
Yes.
8th November.
People are saying that shock has
Wait.
over.
Show me the evidence. I am citing you 2 people you have quoted. Their things show 8th November, 1 quarter. Even CMI, 1 quarter. There are other things around 8th of November. Was RERA a good thing? I think most people except builders and speculators will say RERA was a good thing.
Was the right thing, yeah.
Was the detection of 2 lakh shell companies a good thing? Most people would say it was a good thing. Was the detection of 16,000 shell companies operating out of a single post box in Bara Bazaar in Calcutta a good thing? I think most people would say it was a good thing. Was the lowering of the black component in real estate transactions in Delhi a good thing? I did not say it has become 0%, but it is distinctly lower. Most people would say it is a good thing. So, I would say it depends on what do you mean by the definition of demonetization. In this broader thing, of course, I think it was a good thing. This is part of the cleaning up of the system.
So, you think that all of these have had an effect on the slowdown of the economy and not necessarily the demonetization shock, or to some extent the GST shock, the 2 big shocks that everybody refers to, why we may be in this state?
You see, the demonetization I am reluctant to react to precisely because of the reason that the question that I asked you. Do we mean what happened on 8th November or around that? If it is around that, of course, it led to a shock, because any cleaning up will lead to a short term shock. I completely agree. Now, so far as GST is concerned, there are 2 kinds of issues.
Do you think that was hurried?
Which one?
GST, do you think it was hurried?
It depends, because there is an ideal GST. The ideal GST means all products and services become part of GST and we have a single rate. A single rate GST or a single rate VAT does not exist in any country in the world.
Yes.
So, although ideally every economist would have said single, de facto it is 3 in most countries in the world. One could have said that let us debate and have a consensus until we have a consensus that all products are included, and we have that. and we could have sat around and debated for another 20 years or 25 years on getting the GST. The alternative way, and by the way, we had already debated the GST for some almost 15 odd years. The alternative way is to say that, look, I know we do not have a perfect GST, but let us start with this and we will tweak as we go along. Now, the tweaking also imparts some degree of uncertainty, because so tweaking also is something that you can look at it two ways. One way to look at it is to say that, hey, look, the GST Council does not know its mind. That is the negative way to look at it. The positive way to look at it is the GST Council is taking cognizance of the feedback that has come in. So, the GST we have is not perfect. It's led to revenue losses on the part of union government as well as state governments. And revenue losses means there's less money to spend on various public goods and services government should be spending money on. But in retrospect, I think that if we had sat around and debated, we would have never had the GST.
So, what's the solution now? As far as GST is concerned, do you expect that any of the exempted items, exempted areas, will they be brought in? How does the centre increase the GST revenues, and how much is there an assessment that you have of how much the leakage is out of GST?
No. You see, there are three reactions that I have. The first kind of reaction that I have is that I think it's time that we insisted that all MSME should be part of the GST net, even if they pay zero taxes. This is necessary because the GST system operates on the basis of matching invoices.
So, no exemptions, everybody must register.
Must register even if it is zero tax, because otherwise you do not have the invoice matching. Now, this is of course a call that the GST Council has to take, but this is sort of this would be my recommendation. The second thing of course is that the GST rates are the average GST rate is too low, and most people, certainly urban people and certainly readers of Business Today and people who watch English language TV would want the 28% rate to be lowered, but would not want the 0% rate to be hiked. You cannot have it both ways. Standardization means higher rates come down, lower rates go up. So, we must fix this. The GST Council will again decide when and how to fix it. However, when growth rates are low, it is probably not the best time to do this.
Yes.
The third thing I would say is one should seriously reconsider the idea of revenue compensation, because it has led to a perverse incentive with states wanting more and more taxes in the 0% category. So, those are the three things I would say on GST.
So, relook at the revenue compensation, but if there is this buzz that there will be an increase in GST,
well, the finance
GST rates, 5 may become 8, is this the right time to do it? Won't it slow down the economy further?
Well, firstly, I have already said that I do not think this is the right term to say it, and secondly, if I recall correctly, the finance minister herself said that the buzz exists everywhere outside in her office.
Except in her office, yes. How do you expect the farmers' income to be doubled by 2022-23 that the government is committed to doing?
There is a difference between a farmer's income that comes only from agriculture and a farmer's income that comes from outside. Too often, we tend to presume that a farmer's income comes only from crop cultivation, and that too only from rice and wheat or food crops. There has already been quite a bit of diversification, commercialization away from conventional agriculture. So, the doubling in income comes from that, not the traditional crops. There is already a plan that is in the public domain, which has been done by Niti Aayog. It is in public domain, which sets out the details of all of this, because there is a long list of various reforms that need to be done to ensure commercialization, diversification, freeing up of distribution channels, marketing, relook at input subsidies, the way output is procured, all of that. So, it's a long list of reforms. As I said, it's in the public domain.
Dr. Debroy, from what I could gather from this discussion is that you are setting very low expectations from budget 2020, that we should not expect big bang announcements. Instead, we should stick to the knitting, let it settle, let the economy settle, and that the growth will come back by itself. Am I getting it right? Or you would rather have confidence building measures, which is exactly what the last budget was all about. I think pretty much the interim budget and the first budget of the current Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman was about confidence building measures, and all along she has done many of these tinkering, including the big one of merger of banks. But everything is more about sticking to the knittings, let the economy settle, and no big bang announcements.
Broadly, yes. I just add perhaps 2 or 3 more sentences. Sentence number 1 is, reforms are always steady state. Never have reforms in big bang except in 1991, which was exceptional circumstances. So, reforms will always be steady state. Secondly, the budget is only one instrument out of several instruments the government has, and there is a continuity. There is a continuity between the term of the first Narendra Modi government and the second Narendra Modi government, and the continuity between the initiatives that the government has on the other 364 days and what happens on budget day. So, on the budget day proper, therefore, it is unrealistic in my view, and indeed that is exactly what you have said, to have any big bang announcements.
Oh, that's very interesting, and that was Dr. Bibek Debroy, the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, giving his views on the budget. Thank you, Dr. Bibek.